Welcome again, everyone. This is our Plastic Pollution Coalition Global Webinar Series, where we bring together our community to share the latest information, tips, resources, solutions to help stop our global plastic pollution crisis. Plastic Pollution Coalition is a global alliance. We are over 1,200 organizations, businesses, and thought leaders in 75 countries, working toward a world free of plastic pollution. We educate, connect, and advocate for a world free of plastic pollution. So here are a couple tips for this webinar. We invite you to participate in our poll questions. Thank you everyone who introduced yourself in the chat. We are seeing some really cool locations all over the globe where people are joining from. We are going to switch over to the Q&A. So we'll be turning off the chat, but don't despair. You can still put your questions in the Q&A if you find that at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be sure to have a great discussion today with our panelists. We invite you also to share on social. Here's some of our panelists' social accounts, so feel free to do that as the webinar goes on. All right, let's get started with some poll questions. So we want to hear from you. Tell us more about yourself. Tell us who you are. Are you a student? Are you a researcher? Do you work at an NGO business? You have 20 seconds to fill this poll out now, so go ahead and do it. All right, we have a lot of concerned citizens on this webinar today. Thank you so much for being here. We have a lot of organization, NGO representatives, some students, some teachers, some researchers, some business people. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's go ahead and go to the second poll. We want to hear where you're joining from. You might have put it in the chat, but go ahead and let us know right here where are you joining us from today? Okay, lots of North America, Central America, and some other locations too. So thanks for that info. Finally, we have one final poll today. This is on our webinar topic, which is all about corporate campaigns. So what have you done to hold corporations responsible for plastic pollution? You can select all that apply. Have you signed a petition? Have you boycotted a brand or company? Have you attended a protest? Written an email or letter to a company, spoken to a store manager, or have you done nothing yet and you want to learn more, or something else? Go ahead and put it in now. All right, a lot of petition signers, that's exciting. A lot of other activism going on here with boycotting, protesting, all kinds of things. So excited for you all to be here with us and learn some more ways that you can take action. All right, so our topic today is campaigning against corporate polluters. How can you get involved? And how does Plastic Pollution Coalition campaign against corporate polluters? We have a number of things that we do. We work with our coalition partners to originate different campaigns, targeting Amazon and Coca-Cola, asking them to reduce their plastic footprint on the earth. We're excited to co-lead the Break Free from Plastic Corporate Campaigns Working Group. And we are very excited to be working to change the popular narrative about plastic pollution in social media. So this is just a funny meme that we shared on Instagram from our coalition member, Final Straw. So these are the kind of some of the ways that we're really engaging on this topic and trying to change the narrative from that plastic pollution is the responsibility of individual consumers to change, and instead focusing on those corporations that are creating so much plastic in the first place. So we are so excited to have our webinar today. Our speakers, we are joined already by Shilpi Chhotray, the Global Communications Lead for Break Free from Plastic, and Mike Schade, Mind the Store Campaign Director of Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. Unfortunately, Eve Fox was not able to join us today, but instead we have Judith Inc, the founder and president of Beyond Plastics. Our panelists will each speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A discussion. So get your questions ready and be sure to populate the Q&A. All right, so I'm going to introduce Shilpi first. Shilpi Chhotray is the Global Communications Lead for Break Free from Plastic. She is responsible for organizing all the communication flows between Europe, Asia, and North America. And she is a frequent media speaker. Previous to Break Free from Plastic, Shilpi worked at Mission Blue, the Sylvia Earle Alliance. And if you don't know, Shilpi lives in Oakland, where she has a zero waste skincare company called Samudra Skin and Sea. So we're very excited to have Shilpi here. So take it away.
Awesome, great to be here. Hi, everyone, and thanks very much to Emily and the Plastic Pollution Coalition team, who I've loved for many years, for inviting me to be here today with all of you. If you're not familiar with Break Free from Plastic, we are a global movement of more than 2,000 organizations worldwide with a strong grassroots advocacy muscle. As global communications lead, a large part of my role is centering voices of communities most impacted by industry and corporate polluters. So I'd like to quickly set the stage on what all this means with a few slides that demonstrate how narrative has been a very powerful tool in corporate campaigning, and who tells the story and how often is critical. So next slide, please. This is the first example. The Bloomberg article here celebrates plastic as the hero of coronavirus. On the flip, the next slide, a New York Times article features our members from Tejas, the Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Series, who live by petrochemical facilities where plastic is made. And their community is already struggling with severe respiratory illnesses from living so close to fossil fuel production, which puts them at a disadvantage for the current pandemic as well. Not to mention, a lot of the community members are blue-collar workers and need to show up physically to work every day and cannot necessarily work from the comfort of their homes. Example 2, next slide. Here's a media moment from a Taiwanese plastics company called Formosa Plastic, which was considered too polluting for Taiwan. They chose to site the facility in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, a predominantly low-income Black community. The next slide features Sharon Levine. She was born and raised here and tells her story in a media outlet called Truth Out, pointing out that Louisiana is one of the most rampant hotspots of the coronavirus in the country, and that building this plant would destroy her community and ancestral heritage. The good news is because of the work of many of our movement members, including Sharon, this plant is currently suspended in terms of permitting. So that's really great news and a big one for us. Example 3 is the last example. We've heard this so many times that Asia is to blame for the plastic pollution crisis. It's incredibly false information from media and corporations headquartered in the global north. We're starting to be more prolific in getting the real narrative out there, which includes, on the next slide, the truth behind where all this waste is actually coming from. And it's largely from Western industrialized nations like the United States. So that's it for my slides. When we look at plastic pollution, we're talking about the entire life cycle, from extraction to disposal. Historically, plastics have been painted as an oceans problem and led by large environmental NGOs focused on wildlife. It's only in the last few years that we've been able to shift the focus on extraction, looking at where plastic comes from in the first place. This has been a monumental success in how we talk about plastic, because the narrative since the 1970s, which was largely crafted by industry, was that recycling was going to save the day. And it's on the consumer to deal with the end of life of this product, even though only 9% of plastic has been recycled since the 1950s. That number is steadily decreasing as well. So we know that real change will only come from addressing the root cause of the crisis. With the global membership of nearly 2,000 groups, including PPC's coalition, Beyond Plastics and Mind the Store, part of our strength is our strength in numbers and campaigning against corporate polluters who keep pumping out plastic with no end in sight. So I'm really excited to hear from Mike and Judith as well, two of our key thought leaders in the movement. And lastly, our most successful campaign against corporate polluters is something everyone can get involved with. It's called the brand audit. It's essentially taking coastal cleanup to the next level by not only looking at the types of plastic in the waste stream, but also the brands. And it's not limited to coastlines and beaches, because plastic is, well, everywhere. So this is the third year we've organized the brand audit globally. We have a big report release coming December 2nd. So please mark your calendars for the reveal of the top corporate polluters this year. In 2020, we engaged nearly 15,000 volunteers in 55 countries to conduct 575 brand audits. This is a record-breaking number. Even with the pandemic, we were able to do it safely. We also worked with 300 informal waste pickers to highlight their role as essential workers. And corporations that have been identified as top polluters for the last 3 years have been continuously concerned because we've been able to undermine their social license and credibility through this process. So to close, I just want to reiterate that whose stories are told, who tells them, and who hears them are an enormously important part to achieving the change we seek today.
Thank you so much, Shilpi. That's wonderful. We are also excited about the new brand audit report coming out. So thanks for talking about that today. So let's go over to Mike Schade. I'll introduce Mike Schade. He's the Mind the Store campaign director for Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, where he coordinates the national campaign challenging leading retailers to really transform the marketplace away from hazardous chemicals and towards safer alternatives. Mike was previously with the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, a national environmental health organization, and he lives in Brooklyn, New York. Go ahead, Mike.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you so much to the Plastic Pollution Coalition for inviting me and for the opportunity to talk about our campaign. If you could pull my slides up if you haven't yet, I'd appreciate it. So we launched the campaign back in 2013, 7 years ago, in collaboration with dozens of organizations across the country to call on the nation's biggest retailers to drive toxic chemicals out of consumer products, packaging, and global supply chains. Fundamental to the campaign is this idea that retailers have a fundamental responsibility to ensure that the products that they sell are safe and healthy for consumers. So we target retailers who are downstream users of chemicals because we think it's a real strategic point of intervention to drive change across global supply chains. Over the years, we've targeted chemicals of concern that are commonly found in plastics like phthalates, which are used in PVC, bisphenol A, which is in polycarbonate, flame retardants that are in all sorts of plastics, as well as toxic plastics like PVC and polystyrene. One of the reasons we target retailers is because we as consumers, retailers are hearing that consumers care. Consumers want to know that the products that they buy, the packaging, is safe and healthy for their families and are not going to contaminate or poison communities where these products are made, like in Cancer Alley, Louisiana, or where they're disposed of, like in Detroit. So we're really working to leverage the purchasing power and the market influence of retailers to drive transformative change. When we launched the campaign 7 years ago in 2013, we started by focusing on top 10 US retailers by sales, and over time we've steadily expanded the campaign to a broader universe of companies, focus on 50 of the biggest retailers in North America, who together have billions of dollars, actually trillions of dollars in purchasing power at over 200,000 stores across North America. So I want to talk a little bit about our campaign, particularly to address PFAS chemicals in food packaging. Actually, if you can go back to the previous slide, please. So we started this work on PFAS in food packaging a couple of years ago. For those of you that may not be aware, these are chemicals that are commonly found in food packaging. Actually, they're a regrettable substitute to single-use plastics. Over the years, we've seen many companies eliminating polystyrene in takeout containers, but sadly, they've moved in many cases to compostable food containers that are literally loaded with these chemicals. The family of PFAS chemicals include over 5,000 chemicals, and they're typically added to make the food packaging more grease resistant. And you'll see in the picture there, that's an example of one of these compostable containers. These are extremely toxic. They've been linked to cancer. They're referred to as hormone disruptors, so they can interfere with our hormonal systems, and they can even weaken our immune system, making us more vulnerable to infectious diseases like COVID-19. And we're especially concerned about their use in food packaging. Packaging is used once, but the chemicals can last forever in the environment. When they're disposed of in an incinerator or dumped in a landfill, the chemicals can migrate out and they can last forever in the environment. So really nasty chemicals really have no place in our food packaging. When they're used in compostable packaging, they can also, of course, not only get into the food, but they can also contaminate the compost when the packaging is disposed of. And because of their widespread use, they've literally contaminated the drinking water of millions of Americans across the country. So a couple of years ago, we put out this report, as you'll see here, investigating PFAS in food packaging at 5 of the top grocery chains in America. We collected samples all across the country, as you see here, in about a dozen states. Next slide, please. And in our report, we found that 2/3 of the takeout containers tested positive for likely presence of PFAS. And just from this one report alone, we were able to win precedent-setting commitments from 4 out of the 5 companies whose packaging we tested. So that really kind of shows the power that product testing investigations like this can have to drive change. At Whole Foods alone, we found PFAS in their takeout containers, and Whole Foods switched those out, and that affected over 100 million containers a year. And that's a lot of toxic trash, of course. Next slide, please. Over time, we have now expanded the campaign not only to address grocery store chains, but we're now focused on fast food chains as well. This summer, we put out this report investigating PFAS at top fast food chains, burger chains like Burger King and McDonald's, and healthier food chains. We found nearly half of all samples we collected tested positive for the likely presence of PFAS. Next slide, please. And from this one report, we were able to win commitments from a number of major fast food and fast casual chains to take action. That together over the past year, or the past 2 years, we've won commitments from retailers with over 17,000 stores across North America that have committed to eliminating PFAS in their packaging at chains like Taco Bell and Sweetgreen, Chipotle. Next slide, please. One of the companies that has not yet moved is McDonald's. They, of course, are the biggest fast food chain, not only here in the US, but globally. And sadly, we found PFAS in popular items at McDonald's, like their French fries and even their Big Mac. Here in the US, they sell over 1 million Big Macs a day. So that's a ton of toxic trash that is clogging up our landfills and incinerators. So as the largest fast food chain in America and the world, we're telling McDonald's that we're not loving it, and we want them to take action and get this toxic trash out and to move towards safer and more sustainable materials like reusables. So if you go to our website at mindthestore.org, you could take action and sign our petition to McDonald's. Over 70,000 people have signed petitions to the CEO over the last couple weeks, and we can use your help to send a strong message to their CEO so that they take action and get these forever chemicals out of their food packaging once and for all. And finally, next slide, I'd just like to note that we are also solutions oriented. These are policy recommendations that we recently put out for top grocery store chains and quick service restaurant chains. So if you're working on food packaging, encourage you to go visit our website, mindthestore.org, and download these resources. And together we can help clean up food packaging and ensure that it's safe and sustainable and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That's really, really so interesting to see all those fast food chains together. And I think it's something that we can all get behind is calling on companies such as McDonald's to stop using these toxic forever chemicals. So thank you so much for that. Now I would like to introduce Judith Inc. Judith Inc. has a long and distinguished career in government and in the nonprofit community on a range of environmental protection issues. She was appointed by President Obama to serve as regional administrator at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and served as Deputy Secretary for the Environment in the New York Governor's Office. She is the founder and president of Beyond Plastics, a national project with the goal of eliminating plastic pollution everywhere. Judith is a frequent media speaker and she has been a visiting faculty member at Bennington since fall 2018. Go ahead, Judith.
Thanks. It's really wonderful to be with you, and I'm so happy to be an event organized by the Plastic Pollution Coalition. That organization does phenomenal work bringing people together. They are a convener of influence. And of course, sharing the podium with Mike and Shilpi is a treat, because those two are really effective. Watch out. You don't want to be on the opposite end of a campaign that they are working on. And I love the topic we're talking about today, because we really are in almost a crisis situation when it comes to plastic pollution. We are turning our oceans into landfills. Plastic pollution is a climate change issue because plastic is made from chemicals and a byproduct of fracking. Plastics is an environmental justice issue because it's in frontline communities are stuck with these facilities that make plastic or incinerators that burn plastic on the waste end. And it's also a health issue. I enjoyed hearing what Mike was talking about in terms of his campaign targeting McDonald's. When my son was growing up, he was a vegetarian with a Happy Meal exemption, because I was a very lenient parent. And I worried about what he was eating at McDonald's. And a lot of people rely on fast food as major source of calories. They're a couple meals a week sometimes. So focusing on these companies is important. I want to tell you a quick story. When I served at the EPA during the Obama administration, there was always almost a parade of vice president for sustainability coming to visit with me from various, well-known corporations. I think they were only visiting with me because they wanted to come to New York City and they had to fill their schedule a little bit. But I always had ideas for them. And there was virtually little follow-up with these vice presidents from sustainability. And I met with one a couple times and I asked him, so why aren't you doing these really obvious things inside your company? And he was very honest with me and said that he's not allowed to launch sustainability initiatives if it costs the company money. So they're willing to do things like a little rebate if you bring your own cup or bring your own bag, but anything that costs them money, they're not interested in. And I appreciated that honesty. And I said, so how do we move the needle then? And he said, the only way to do that is with public pressure, and specifically targeting the company. Now, there is a long history of targeting companies on plastic issues. Just for fun, I pulled out this guide that I worked on in 1990. Do not do the math. Don't figure out how old I am. But in 1990, I was working at the New York Public Interest Research Group, NYPIRG. We put a report out called Plagued by Packaging, and we had a list of companies that we were targeting to change their plastic packaging. It was before email. It was kind of before the internet. So we listed their 1-800 numbers and got lots of students in particular to call them. And the majority of companies that we targeted changed their plastic packaging practices, which was amazing. Mike, one of them was McDonald's. And when people called McDonald's, we told them to call collect because they didn't list their 1-800 numbers. I don't know if you remember that. So there's a long history of doing corporate targeting on plastic pollution. There are some success stories, but I want to point out that it's hard. So I work for a group called Beyond Plastics based at Bennington College in Vermont. Shameless little commercial. I teach an online class on plastic pollution. We're going to offer it again in the evening on Wednesdays starting in February. So let me know if you want to take the class. But what we do is policy, advocacy, and organizing. So we do a limited amount of corporate targeting. And before you take that on, I want to suggest that you think through a few key things. First, pick your target very carefully. It should be something that's interesting and high profile and everyone knows about it. Second, do your research, and then do your research again, and then have people outside your organization look at your research. You have to be 100% right on what you're talking about. If you're not, you will lose credibility. And also, we always want to be accurate. If you're going to target a company or whoever you're targeting, I recommend you talk to them first, call them on the phone, send them a letter, start a dialogue, and then have a schedule. Like, don't have a conversation for a year. Tell them you want to talk to them about a particular issue. It'll take a while to get the meeting or the call. And if they won't meet with you, send them a letter. Just make a good faith effort to engage with them. Most of the time, they're going to blow you off, but you want to take that first step. And next, if you want to do a corporate targeting campaign, don't do it alone. Team up with other organizations. Because there's a lot going on in advocacy world, and you need to break through. And finally, be creative and be timely. Be seasonal. If there's something that comes up during certain holidays, target that. Next slide, please. I just want to talk briefly about two of the campaigns that we've launched at Beyond Plastics. Next slide, please. One involves food delivery apps. We all want to support our local restaurants, particularly the non-chain ones. Don't eat indoors. That's just me as a mom telling you, do not eat indoors wherever you are, but you can get takeout. Now, how many of you had the experience of telling Seamless, DoorDash, Grubhub, or the restaurant directly, all I want is the food. I don't need the condiments. I don't need the utensils. I don't need the straws. I don't need the napkins. And you almost always get it. So we have launched a campaign to try to get these delivery apps to hold the excess plastic. We all have utensils at home. We don't need the plastic utensils. So we have reached out to all of those companies that are listed there and told them that we think the default position is you don't get all that stuff unless you affirmatively ask for it. So there's lots of information on this on our website, beyondplastics.org. Next slide, please. Second campaign we did, which is kind of interesting. I read a peer-reviewed scientific report published last year by McGill University in Montreal. They tested tea bags for the presence of microplastics. They showed that nylon and PET tea bags released microplastics and nanoplastics when you put the tea bag in hot water, which is all the time, right? You never dip your tea bag in cold water. So this study specifically looked at silken sachet tea bags, the really expensive ones, the ones you get at Starbucks, for instance, and they found a significant amount of microplastics. We believe that it's also a problem with paper tea bags that contain thermoplastic fibers. So we targeted 12 tea companies and said, we don't want microplastics in our tea. Almost all of them responded. Most of them said, thanks for bringing it to our attention. We're doing our own sampling now. Some of them said, this is not a problem with our product. We said, prove it. So this is an ongoing campaign. This is also on our website. We invite you to join us in targeting 12 companies that make tea bags, so we are not consuming microplastics or nanoplastics when we have a cup of tea. There was a very good report out of Australia last year that looked at 54 peer-reviewed articles on microplastics. And they concluded that each of us, you and I, consume about one credit card worth of microplastics every week. So that's coming from things like some teas, if there's microplastic in the tea bags, it's coming from bottled water. Microplastics are in the air, they're in our drinking water, particularly bottled water. They've been found in honey, they've been found in beer. Microplastics has been found in sea mist. So we are inhaling or swallowing large amounts of microplastic. What it does to our health, we are not entirely certain, but I'm willing to go out on a limb and say it can't be good. So we have a number of different campaigns going on. Next slide, please. Our website includes something, and I want you to know that you don't have to take on a giant campaign every time. We heard from a few people who wanted to talk to their own supermarket store manager about having less plastic in their own supermarket. So we designed, we wrote a model letter that you can send to your own supermarket manager, and people are doing that. So here's all our contact information. Follow us on Twitter, follow us on Facebook. We're always interested in new ideas. And we're also interested in collaborating on campaigns. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. Incredible work being done at Beyond Plastics. Absolutely incredible. Let's start off our Q&A. We're seeing some great questions coming in here. So this is a question that I'm going to put to each of you panelists. Whoever wants to answer, just go ahead and jump in. This is from Alexandra Rainier from Redwood City. How can we put responsibility back on the plastic producers?
So I'm happy to start on that. I think we need new laws because these companies are not going to change on their own. They know what the right thing is. I mean, I've spoken to companies and they're like, yeah, you're right, but the alternatives are more expensive, so we're not going to switch. And I remember with one major company asking them how much more expensive, and it was ½ cent per carton. And I'm like, you know, people are willing to pay another ½ cent to avoid plastic. So I have to admit, I have a certain world view on how to approach things. So if you go to a surgeon with a medical problem, she's likely going to tell you you need surgery. If you come to me as a former regulator, I'm going to say we need laws and we need strong regulations and strong enforcement of the law. So I want to mention the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which has been introduced in the Congress. It's Senate Bill 3263, House Bill 5845. This is a landmark bill. It's the strongest bill on plastic pollution ever introduced in the history of the Congress. It does some really basic stuff that I think we could all get behind, like banning plastic bags, plastic straws only upon request. Thank you, Jackie Nunes, for your leadership on plastic straws. Polystyrene foam ban for food packaging. There's also a key provision that tells the US EPA to figure out how to do extended producer responsibility. So what does that mean? That means that if you're a company producing a product or packaging, you have to take it back and you have to recycle it. So it addresses this economic disconnect that we have today. Coke and Pepsi flood the market with plastic soda bottles, for instance, and unless they're in a bottleable state, which is only 10 in the country, they don't have any responsibility legally or economically to take that packaging back, make sure it's not littered, make sure it's recycled. They sell it and then they're done. But with extended producer responsibility, these generators of waste would have to take economic responsibility to take back their material. It's a sound concept. You have it for some electronic waste. California has it on carpet. Bottle bills are the best example of extended producer responsibility. So while individual action is crucial, we need systemic change, and we will only get that by passing laws.
I can chime in shortly here. I know Mike probably has some words to say. Fully agree with Judith that legislation and policy is absolutely where it's at, but as consumers, we have enormous wallet power, is what you've probably heard this term, how consumers can really shape what brands are putting out into the market. And, you know, companies have a moral responsibility to shift to alternative delivery systems and make sure they're not greenwashing. Break Free from Plastic advocates for systems of refill and reuse. So we're seeing some of that. You may have heard of Loop, but the problem with Loop, it's only pioneered in very affluent cities. So how do we get that kind of model to scale that's accessible for low-income communities and communities in Asia, which are being inundated with low-value, multi-layer, single-use plastic in the form of sachets. So it's important, you know, if you can't participate in like a full brand audit, use the power of writing letters to brands. Everything's on e-commerce these days, tagging them on social media and saying, this is unacceptable, we deserve better. And dropping some stats that a lot of what you're hearing here, and visiting like the Plastic Pollution Coalition website for ways to actually target companies on social media.
Great. A lot of questions about reusable containers. I wondered if Mike too, you could speak to, are there compostable single-use containers that are not contaminated with PFAS? Someone wants to know. And then also, you know, a follow-up to that, you know, what do we do about reusables during this global pandemic that we're now have been in for, you know, over 8 months? So go ahead, Mike, if you want to start with that one.
Yeah, I'll just mention briefly that on the alternative side, I mean, certainly there's plenty of alternatives to PFAS in food contact materials. You know, a number of, on the policy front, as Judith mentioned, there have been cities and states that have adopted policies banning PFAS in food packaging, like San Francisco and Berkeley have enacted ordinances. The states of Washington and Maine have passed state level laws that go into effect in 2022. There's pending legislation here in New York that is awaiting New York Governor Cuomo's signature. So between the policy movement and the market momentum that I mentioned, you know, with thousands of stores banning PFAS, you know, the market is transitioning to alternatives. Certainly, you know, we think reusable systems are really where the food industry needs to move. But in the near term, where maybe that may not be possible in some instances, or maybe if there's not a political will, there is food packaging that is out there that is compostable, for example, that doesn't contain PFAS. So one of the predominant certifying bodies that is out there for biodegradable materials is BPI, and they adopted a new standard this year that went into effect January 1st that limits and restricts PFAS in biodegradable food contact materials. So you can go to the Biodegradable Products Institute website and actually see examples of food packaging that meets our standards that does not contain intentionally added PFAS. In addition, we recently published a fact sheet on our website. You go to mindthestore.org, that has examples of brands that offer PFAS-free food packaging and all sorts of different types of packaging materials. But certainly, I think in the near to medium to long term, we really need to move to reusable systems. I think Loop is really an exciting example of that. But one thing that I think is really critical is to ensure that reusables are safe too, that we're not moving from single-use toxic material to reusable material that may contain other chemicals of high concern. So as we're moving towards a more circular economy, we need to make sure that that circular economy is also safe and healthy for the communities where those reusable materials are manufactured and disposed of. because it's not going to do anyone good if those reusables contain toxic ingredients that may be someone else's environmental nightmare.
Emily, I just want to follow up on compostable packaging. Mike effectively covered the PFAS element of that, but when it says compostable, it doesn't mean you should put it in your backyard compost bin if you have it. It's only compostable in commercial composting operations that reach high temperatures. And typically, you know, most communities don't have those facilities. Maybe there's one or two in the entire state if you're lucky. So when something says compostable, people need to know what it means. You need to find out if there is a commercial composting facility locally that would take it. And the majority of the time, the answer is no. So while it may not be made from petrochemicals, it is, the whole compostable term can get a little confusing to consumers.
And recyclers really don't like when compostable materials enter their infrastructure because it could really damage their processes.
Great points. Absolutely. Reusable systems are what we all need to move to. It's absolutely right. Question for you, Judith, and perhaps Shilpi too, and Mike, if you want to jump in as well. From Julie, what is your reaction to the EPA announcing that they will increase recycling to 50% by 2030 across the US, since we know that recycling is not the answer? Judith, you want to kick it off?
Sure. So, you know, my response is big yawn. We need to focus on waste reduction and refill. If you look at any solid waste hierarchy, you know, the classic hierarchy pyramid, reduce and reuse is on the top, followed by recycle, compost, bury and burn. And in practice, the hierarchy is flipped upside down. Most of the money and attention goes to bury and burn. So we need to get serious about the top rung of the hierarchy. I strongly support recycling. I set up my town's recycling program years ago. However, plastic recycling has been a failure. The plastic recycling rate is only 8.5%. So that means over 90% of plastic doesn't get recycled. It either gets exported to other countries, and you should all watch the amazing movie, The Story of Plastic, which documents how plastic is now a human rights issue with all of these exports from the EU and US going primarily to Asia and Africa. So I give up on plastic recycling. You know, the industry has told us for 30 years, just throw your recyclables into the blue bin, don't worry about it. In fact, only number 1 and number 2 plastics typically get recycled. Taking the plastic issue aside, I think the EPA goal of 50% recycling is too modest, and we don't have a lot of time. Recycling is a climate change issue, so we need to move rapidly, and I'm really looking forward to the new administration not just setting goals, but actually doing stuff to get us to sustainability practices.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to Judith's excellent points. I work a lot in the world of the waste trade, as Judith mentioned. So much of the wealthier countries' waste, like the US, Canada, and European nations, have been outsourcing their waste problem to developing areas of the world for decades. It's all too often openly dumped and burned. These areas of the world were not meant to capture that kind of waste in their communities. And roughly 60% of US waste is sent overseas. I mean, that's appalling. And for the EPA to continue pushing recycling when it's not working is really just lame. It's horrible. On these trips to Asia, for instance, we found everything from Trader Joe's to Starbucks to L'Oreal in neighborhoods and towns across Southeast Asia. And there's definitely nothing like Trader Joe's in somewhere like Indonesia. Many of you might have heard about the China National Sword Policy, which put the first ban on waste imports in 2018. And now other countries in Asia, largely due to the mobilization of Break Free from Plastic members there, are also stepping up and working with government officials to turn those shipping containers full of plastic and hazardous waste back to our country. However, this waste is now being piled in ports around our country here in the US, and diverted to communities in Latin America and Africa. So what we're seeing in other parts of the world is a humanitarian crisis in a lot of ways that can be traced back to plastic producers in the global north. And this is also why Judith and I and Mike and Emily and others in the movement are so excited about the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, because it actually has a piece of legislation built in that would prevent plastic waste from being shipped to developing countries that cannot manage it. I mean, we need to be handling it at the domestic level.
Absolutely. Kind of going into that a little deeper, Shilpi, if you don't mind. This question is from Susie in Australia. How can we collaborate internationally so we can create a greater impact? We live downstream and the rest of the world is polluting us. The oceans have no borders, so this shouldn't be focused on the policies of one country. We are all in this together. I wondered if you could speak to that, Shilpi.
That's a really great question. And I think, it ties into the earlier part of my presentation, and that, we have been fed this narrative that the US is unfairly being, victimized for the plastic pollution problem. But the reality is the US is a major export of plastic production and packaging, not to mention most of the oil companies that make the plastic products are headquartered here. So absolutely, this is a global issue, but the responsibility really lies on the US government, the US industry and corporations that are producing and marketing this crap in the first place. So, part of the value of Break Free from Plastic is that we are a global movement, and we're constantly creating campaigns and policy suggestions at the global level, so that whatever we're advocating for in one part of the world doesn't negatively impact another part. So I think, in a lot of ways, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is a federal legislation in the United States, but addressing what's happening around the world.
Awesome. We have a question here from Marty. I'm looking for suggestions for positive actions elementary students can take, especially during these COVID times when kids can't do group activities. I would like to add, Marty, I have 3 kids. We're living in a pandemic. It's quite crazy right now. I absolutely would love for you to reach out to us at Plastic Pollution Coalition. We have some educational programs that you might be interested in, including having Jackie Nunez, the founder of The Last Plastic Straw and a program manager with us at Plastic Pollution Coalition, potentially speak with some of your students. There's lots of creative solutions we can do, including things like this, things on Zoom, where we can kind of keep the momentum going. But any panelists, did that question speak to you? Do you have any advice for how we can get youth involved? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I will say, I'll share one idea that just kind of popped into my head. So, as I mentioned, we've been working to push McDonald's to take action on PFAS. We've generated hundreds of stories in the media. We've generated tens of thousands of petitions. So far, the company has not yet responded in a meaningful way. So we are working to amplify pressure on the CEO. And if the children in this class are looking for something to do, if they love McDonald's like I did as a kid growing up, my first job ever was actually at McDonald's as a fry guy. It could be really powerful if the students in the class might consider getting involved in our campaign and maybe sending handwritten letters to the CEO of McDonald's, urging them to make their packaging safer, or maybe even having a little classroom coloring contest I know that we're not in the classrooms, but folks can color from home and mail little cute pictures to the CEO of McDonald's about how they like the packaging to be pollution-free and safe and not contain these chemicals. So if you're interested, you can reach out to me, and I'd love to talk with you about that, because I think that could be a fun little tactic to pursue to send a nice little message to the CEO of McDonald's. He hasn't listened to us yet, but maybe he'll listen to the children. So that's all I got.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's so great. Thank you. We have so many questions coming in, but just a reminder that we're going to be sending a follow-up email with a lot of the links that were mentioned today. We have all kinds of links that you can check out and get more information, and hopefully your question will be answered in that way. And we also would love for you to get involved with some of the campaigns that were mentioned. We'll definitely send you our Amazon campaign, and we'll have follow-up links from each of our panelists. So thank you to each of our panelists. So appreciate you being with us today and sharing your wisdom and the ways that you are targeting corporations and holding them accountable for plastic pollution. Definitely a plug to check out our next webinar coming up on December 4th. It will be at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time. It will be in partnership with the Conrad Challenge. And it's called Deep Ocean to Outer Space, Plastic Pollution Solutions, with Dr. Sylvia Earle, President and Chairman of Mission Blue and the National Geographic Society Explorer in Residence, and Dr. Catherine Sullivan, the Chair of Aerospace History at the Smithsonian Museum, and that will be moderated by our co-founder and CEO of Plastic Pollution Coalition, Deanna Cohen. So definitely join us for that. Thank you very much for being here tonight with us today, wherever in the world you are. And definitely share on social media if you found something relevant and something that you'd like to share. Go ahead and tag us. You can join our coalition, contact us with any further questions. And thank you all for being here tonight.